All right, everyone, it's 4 o'clock. So perhaps we will get started. Just wanting to give a few people some time to trickle in here and making sure everybody is good to go. That's wonderful. So, hi, everyone. My name is Tara Howse, and I am so happy and excited to be your host this afternoon for this discussion on urban and rural transit on behalf of the West Coast Climate Action Network. So once again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We do really appreciate your time and interest. Just a little bit about myself. Like I said, my name is Tara. I'm one of the co-founders of the BC Client Alliance. I am also going to give a little plug here for the BCCA. We're a fairly new organization the last couple of years. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, focused on addressing emissions in BC by advocating at the provincial level. So we are always looking for volunteers and partner organizations. So please feel free to check out our website and get some more information from us there. Professionally, I call myself a rural and intersectional researcher. I have a recent master's that looked at how women and Indigenous voices are erased during the resource extraction assessment process. And it's this element of the erasure of women and voices and Indigenous peoples that my passions really, really are. And you'll kind of see this threaded throughout. Ensuring voices that are usually ignored, belittled, devalued, or simply just not being listened to, and trying to bring people back to the center of the decision-making policies and practices that currently exist. In BC and Canada, what this means about putting people in the center, it means actually embedding reconciliation efforts into the foundation of all of our decisions. It means decolonizing how we approach programs and policies. When we look at transportation and climate, we know that transportation means reconciliation. Transportation is all about land use planning. It's about supporting access to services. And it's also understanding some of the reasons that our routes exist. Many roads and highways that we have that we routinely travel are simply there because it was Indigenous peoples that showed settlers the way through various mountain passes or using the rivers. I'm based in Rossland. This is an area traditionally known for and used by the Sahilks, Secwepemc, Tsinaha, and the autonomous Sinaiks for gathering, for cultural exchanges, and salmon runs. And it was a primary method of travel along the Columbia and Kootenay rivers, of course, up until the 60s when the Columbia River was dammed. To date, we only have, there's only 11 of the 94 truth and reconciliation calls to actions that have been implemented, and absolutely no plan to implement the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls plans. When we talk about transportation, it can facilitate all of these calls to action. And so safe transportation choices, whether we're looking in remote areas, all the way to ensuring that the children of the recent recoveries are actually returned to their families. We need to embed social justice principles into our approaches to climate change, prioritizing reconciliation efforts. And so with this, today is the West Coast Climate Action Network's first of a 4-part series on the transportation in the time of climate crisis. Our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, April 13th, with a focus on active transportation. On May 11th, we'll be focusing on smart communities, trip reduction, and finishing up on June 8th, we'll be focusing on car sharing, electric vehicles, cargo bikes, and freight. Each of the webinars have 4 aims. We want to lay out the best transportation policies and solutions for a socially just, inclusive, and flourishing BC that uses 100% renewable energy. We want to write a brief policy paper that outlines the best policies and solutions, both municipally and for the province. We want to engage with organizational partners in BC who share the same vision. And we want to write a sign-on letter or petition to the relevant political leaders, urging specific actions and to gain wide participation. And this last point is something we'll be coming back to near the end. So I just want to do a couple of quick polls here before we get started. I just kind of want to understand where everybody is living and kind of what area. So I'm hoping Sebastian there can get our first poll up about location. So we'll just take a second here. If you can kind of give it a little read through, let us know what area you best identify with. And Sebastian, when you think most of the responses are in, please feel free to close that. I think we're still waiting for some coming in. And so the results of the poll All right, having a little tech background. Here we go. Poll location. Oh, not surprisingly, we've got most people here coming in from the lower mainland, followed by the Vancouver Island coastal area. We've got some people represented here in Thompson, Okanagan, the Kootenays, Caribou, but North Coast, and there's, it looks like one person here from the Northeast. So those are Fraser Valley. We're just a quick location thing. It'd be really interesting. Just we wanted to have an idea of what the geography was represented today. Our second poll here, again, really quickly, just looking for kind of 30 seconds here. We want to know, what is your usual use of public transportation? Do you use it regularly? Do you use it sometimes or very rarely? So we're just going to get that second poll up here. Sebastian's just getting that typed up here. Once again, everyone's still trickling in. Thank you so much. If you could just answer the poll very quickly here. How often do you typically use public transportation? And I'll just leave that up for a second. And don't worry, everyone, I'm going to stop talking soon and we'll get to the presenters, whom I know we're all really excited to see today. All right, and results on that, sort of a mixed bag. I would say most people then are using public transportation. Only 34% of people said that they do not have public transportation. And you know what, I can definitely relate to that. Living in a rural area, this is one of the reasons it's nice to have this urban rural idea, because transportation looks different depending on where we are. And so we have 21% of people say they regularly use public transport. 45% say they sometimes do, and 34% of people say they do not. Well, hopefully we can start talking about some solutions and start increasing that usage rate. With that, I promised you I was going to stop talking. I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker today, is Chief Judy Wilson. She's been serving her community as chief for 14 years and is a current executive member of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. She's a strong advocate for the recognition of inherent title and rights, preservation of lands, water, and wildlife, and has stood against exploitive and dangerous resource projects such as Mount Polley Mine, and routinely speaks out against the violence and aggression against Indigenous women, children, and elders who are defending their land and water. I'll turn it over now to Chief Wilson to discuss transportation, climate, and some specific considerations for Indigenous peoples here in BC.
Thank you for addressing me as Chief Judy Wilson. In our language, Chief means chief, and I'm chief of the Nisquamish Indian Band, and I'm part of the Secretary Treasurer for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and part of the First Nations Leadership Council. And I sit on many different committees, climate change and children and family and land territory resources with the Assembly of First Nations. And as mentioned, I've been over to the United Nations, both in Geneva and New York, and most recently over to COP26 in Scotland in November, and all regarding our climate emergency and crises, especially with what we experienced here in BC. So I'll go over about half a dozen different points, and part of that is the transportation needs in the climate emergency. So frequently, an intensity of climate-related disasters is increasing and will continue to increase until global greenhouse gas emissions reach net zero and below. And while I was in Glasgow, what we realized, and which was being explained, is even if we reach net zero, we have to maintain it. So there's a lot of work to do. We can't ever go back to what people are calling normal, because now that's all drastically changed. And Canada is actually warming 2 times faster. And it's interesting because we're considered developed, even though a lot of our First Nations live in third world poverty. Canada is considered a developed country, so it's usually the undeveloped countries that are warming, but it's unusual that Canada is warming at 2 times the rate. So reliable access to supplies and evacuation corridors needs to be a significant aspect of community level emergency planning and must be inclusive of peoples who don't drive personal vehicles. A lot of our people live below the poverty line, so a lot of times they don't have access to transportation, so they do need to have the public transportation. It's important, and important gap that our people are affected by. So the second point is transportation options at lower emissions. There is huge infrastructure gaps for safe, affordable, and sustainable transportation within and between communities, especially outside of major cities and in the north. Our existing infrastructure forces community members to rely on personal vehicles, mostly due to the lack of viable alternatives. But as I mentioned, most of our people live in poverty, so this means hitchhiking or coordinating rides or trying to schedule, to make it to where they're going. And this is really problematic with a lot of people with health issues and mothers with young kids and things like that. So as a result, our community members disproportionately suffer from the shocks to the energy supply, and we're seeing right now with the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions on the Russian oil. And unlike a tax on carbon at the pump, the revenues from the surge in gas prices is going to oil companies, not towards new public infrastructure. So that's really important point to underscore. Robust public transportation services are needed to ensure that we're actually transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I'm on many front lines and across BC and other parts in North America in regards to the dirty fossil fuel oils like tar sand and fracking gas. I think with fracking gas, BC is actually increasing fracking gas, whereas in California they banned it, and in Oregon, Washington, some of the other states they're shifting away by 2030, I think, or around there. But in BC, I'm very concerned because we're actually going the wrong way. Every dollar that BC spends to build new roads and highways is money that should be allocated towards safe and sustainable transportation that is accessible to everyone. Transportation and missing murdered Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit crisis. The need for transportation solutions throughout the province is twofold. Current gaps are not only intensifying by the climate crisis, they're exacerbated by unequal social conditions for northern communities that are actually structuring the vulnerability. Addressing the gaps in transportation and missing murdered women, girls, and Two-Spirit crisis. Significant gaps in transportation have been directly linked to the violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit throughout BC. Without access to safe transportation, Indigenous women and girls face uncertainty and unsafe commuting along lonely rural highways, and having faced violence and addictive predation resulting in disappearance and murder. And over the holiday, I know Regional Chief was sharing with us all the missing murdered women posters. There was like half a dozen, and that was over the holiday, and it was really heartbreaking to see those posters come through, and that they've missed, a lot more of our women and girls in Two-Spirit are missing, and we're not sure what it's connected to, if it's the man camps or why there was such an increase, but it was really heartbreaking to see that. Compounding the gaps in transportation services are the barriers that exist for Indigenous women and girls in accessing driver's license and training, particularly if they live in rural and remote communities. Without access to a driver's license and due to systemic racism and licensing and training process in BC, these women and girls are forced to hitchhike along dangerous stretches of highways and face challenges in accessing their traditional territories, as well as accessing education, employment, and healthcare. And just as I underscored, there's a lot of poverty with our people. So it even if they're able to get their driver's license and own and maintain a vehicle, it still leaves huge gaps in the disproportionate effects. Connections between rural and remote areas and violence. Notably, Highway 16, the Highway of Tears, is known as a string of devastating and traumatic murders and disappearance of Indigenous women and girls dating back decades. Highway 16 is a key corridor between Prince George and Prince Rupert that runs through a number of First Nation communities. Territories in BC are vast and are often connected by isolated rural highways. Advocates and family members of missing murdered Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit from northern BC have tirelessly fought to be included at decision-making tables and see increased services, infrastructure, transportation resources to protect women and girls and address the heightened precarity of living in rural Indigenous communities. And I want to acknowledge Gladys Radek. She's been doing a lot of this work for many, many years. as well as the Carriesa County Tribal Council. And Gladys, last year, she did a pole raising there on Highway 16 as a commemorating, a lot of the women and girls in Two-Spirit that went missing and murdered there, but also for a place for families to go and do their offerings and do their prayers for the loved ones they lost on the highway there. So I really commend and uphold Gladys Raddick for the amazing work she's done through the Highway of Tears Walks for Justice, and that's gone across Canada. So she's an amazing lady. Resource extraction and man camps and gender-based violence. Remote areas also house extensive industrial and resource extraction projects that are associated with labor man camps. These work camps have been linked to increased violence towards Indigenous women and girls, and highlighting the increased need for security in those rural communities and commuting throughout the region. And I know there was a study and a report done that shows the resource extraction and the increase with murder and violence to Indigenous women. So that report underscored all these issues I just raised. The lack of transportation creates conditions for hyper precarity and unsafety. In no uncertain terms, the lack of safe, reliable, and accessible transportation in this and other rural areas has contributed to the missing murdered women and girls in Two-Spirit Plus crisis. Gaps in safe and affordable transportation make it difficult for those fleeing domestic violence or those seeking to access services, education, employment opportunities, and can lead people to resort to hitchhiking. National inquiry calls for justice. The National Inquiry into Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in Two-Spirit Plus clearly laid out the increased levels of risk and violence and need to immediately fill such gaps to provide Indigenous women and girls with a safe and reliable transportation network, including a safe rides program. Calls for justice 4.8, 8.1, and 17.9 call upon the government transportation service providers to ensure adequate plans and funding for Indigenous women and girls and the 2SL LGBTQIA people living in rural communities, including special accommodations for remote fly-in communities, as well as service providers to undertake training to identify and respond to sexual exploitation and reporting policies. 8, the work that's still needed and the calls to action. Given the grim realities of ongoing violence, these discussions and actions are essential. Expanded transportation include BC-wide public service, a Northern BC bus program, safe rides, and overall accessible transportation services for Indigenous communities are urgently needed to end the genocide occurring in the province. The dual crisis of missing murdered women and girls in Two-Spirit and the climate emergency are colliding with devastating consequences. Expanded transportation is tangible action that can help to reduce greenhouse gas and emissions while creating sustainable and desperately needed safe transportation for Indigenous people who have for too long have paid the price of going without. What's more, these actions are fundamental as a part of the calls for justice and government's obligations under the National Action Plan and are important for alignment under the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, both under the federal UN Declaration Implementation Act and the provincial UN Declaration Implementation Act. So that's what I had to offer today, and I'm glad to be part of this virtual circle and discussing these important issues that disproportionately affect our Indigenous communities. And I'm just traveling, so I'm going to be listening as long as I can and partaking in the circle. Thank you for having me, Cook's Jam.
Cook T. Wilson, we really do appreciate it so much. Everyone here from the West Coast Climate Action Network, and as well as all the participants. I will just make a note that we are actually going to be doing Q&A after Eric's presentation here in a second. So please feel free to make some notes, within yourself and think about some great questions that we have going on. There's some really wonderful topics that we can carry on here. And I do want to, in closing from Chief Wilson, I do actually really want to encourage everybody here to take a moment. And if you haven't read the Truth and Reconciliation Report, you haven't read the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report, please do that. They're very freely and available and accessible. And it's so important as we move forward in any of our decision-making processes to really consider how, as a country and as a province, we should be moving forward with that. And on that note, please allow me to introduce Eric Doherty. Eric is the principal of EcoPath Planning, and he's based in Victoria. He's a registered professional planner who focuses on practical ways of reducing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions while improving the livability of communities. Eric has been doing environmental consulting and contract work for 20 years. Today, he's here to discuss what a public transit network can look like in our local communities amidst the current climate crisis. Eric, please take it away.
Thank you, Tara. And thank you, Chief Judy Wilson. It's a big challenge you've set out for me to follow with the outlining how critical the problems we're facing are. I'm just going to share my screen and start a presentation. Yeah, so I'm speaking from the Lekwungen territory, which is now represented by the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I'm going to be trying to present from a climate justice perspective. And that requires respecting and acknowledging the Indigenous leadership on many issues, including the leadership that it took to get the BC Bus North service functioning. We're in a climate crisis. That's what the title of this is all about. It's what do we need to do on transportation in a climate crisis? And I think the main thing I want to emphasize here is that delay means death, as the United Nations Secretary General put it. We don't have time to do things that we might have been able to do that would be really nice if we'd started 20 or 30 years ago. And our transportation emissions are going up, up, up. It's about 40% of the total in BC. Numbers vary depending on how you count it. And great public transit is essential for getting this trend reversed and emissions going down. I want to start with a concept and a person who is important, I think, in this issue. Fellow by the name of Paul Meese popularized the term the network effect to explain that transit service to whole regions, to whole countries, affects how people act. It affects whether they ride transit. So transit in the suburbs affects how many people in the core of the city will ride transit. And the quality of transit or the lack of transit in rural areas affects not only how people in rural areas travel, but also whether people in cities own cars and ride transit. I think we also need to understand the political context that we're operating in. In 2021, the last UN climate talks, the oil and auto industries worked really hard to narrow the focus down to just zero emission cars and trucks. They even titled their declaration on accelerating the transition to 100% zero emission cars and vans. But people fought back. Members of the European Parliament, cycling groups, a whole bunch of civil society groups pushed very hard to also have the documents acknowledge that we need a wider system transformation, including a lot better public transit. Same conference, the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative. They put forward overwhelming evidence that just a transition to electric cars is not good enough to reach the 1.5% degree target. They're proposing increasing walking and cycling to 50%, basically taking every city on the planet up to the walking, rolling, and cycling excellence of cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen. And I might add places like Seoul, Korea. And they also propose doubling public transit capacity by 2030. And very importantly, creating a lot of transit lanes so that transit riders are no longer stuck in traffic. And we've got some good news locally. The BC government has a new policy in there as of October of last year. The Clean BC roadmap calls for, quote, reducing distances traveled in light duty vehicles by 25% by 2030 compared to 2020 baseline. And this is actually an ambitious target by world standards. This is more ambitious than Scotland put forward last year. And we don't have much of a chance of meeting this target or even making progress unless a lot of groups and individuals understand what it will take to achieve this kind of reduction in driving. This is the Clean BC outline, the graphic that they use to explain how they're going to achieve this target. It's pretty basic, but it puts reducing distances traveled by private vehicles at the top, along with increasing mode shift, which refers to getting people into public transit, walking, cycling. And this is a big, big change from past policy where vehicle electrification dominated, and the issues of automobile ownership and use was pretty much ignored. But this is the present policy context we're in. Most of the money that the province is spending is going to highway expansion. BC government has dozens of urban highway expansion projects on the books. $4 billion proposal to replace the Massey Tunnel, which is 4 lanes, with an 8-lane version. $1 billion highway widening in the Fraser Valley. And then there's all sorts of smaller 10, 20, $100 million projects like the Highway 17 flyover proposed for Greater Victoria. And then the federal government is proposing to spend billions on airport expansion. So most of the money is going to the wrong places. And reallocating infrastructure funds from the wrong places to the right places like public transit is crucial for making the transformation that we need. And the good thing is that civil society groups, many of the groups that you're representing here today, have already signed on to this idea. Over 350 organizations, including many West Coast Climate Action Network groups, have signed on to not only invest, to push to invest in affordable, accessible public transit everywhere in the province, but also crucially to reallocate the infrastructure funds away from the highway expansion where it does harm to the transit and active transportation infrastructure where it does good, both for social justice, health, but also for climate action, for reducing greenhouse gas pollution. A group I'm involved in, Greater Victoria Acting Together, had a campaign along with a number of other local groups to push our regional district to advocate for this shift away from highway expansion, to get the federal and provincial money shifted away from highway expansion to public transit, walking, and cycling. And to me, it's very interesting. Regional districts are the level of government we often forget all about, but they have an obligation and a capacity to lead in transportation in their regions, but they seldom do it. And I'm actually hoping that there's some regional district representatives on this webinar today listening to this and thinking about what they might be able to do. So I'm going to start with or shift to one of the key concepts I think we need to know before we can be successful. One is, use the technical term, induced traffic. I put the hashtag up here so you can look it up more if you want to find more cartoons like this, and videos and everything else on this issue. But it's really very well established that when you expand a congested road or highway, it just fills up, greenhouse gas pollution goes up. And that's true, even if you improve public transit at the same time. And it's also true that if you leave roads exactly the same as they are right now, but improve public transit, you will see an improvement in traffic congestion. You'll see the speeds that people can travel driving their cars and sports utility vehicles kind of move closer to the speed of door-to-door transit speeds. So the better the transit, generally the less the congestion. But the roads stay full. Not much happens with greenhouse gas pollution. So we're seeing a lot of cities all around the world putting in bus lanes and lanes for their streetcars and light rail, as well as bike lanes and all sorts of other things inside the area served by metros and subways. Because they want to not only have good transit, but they want to bring down the greenhouse gas pollution. They want to have people drive less. And the only way you do that really effectively is by reallocating space. And I've got another hashtag, another term, traffic evaporation is what people have started to call this phenomena. So 20 years ago, the paper Disappearing Traffic, the story this so far was published. And it documents that when you reduce road space for cars, and particularly for things like bus lanes and bike lanes, traffic simply evaporates. And to me, the interesting thing about this is this paper has never really been challenged. Nobody has come up with anything to suggest that anything is wrong. So for 20 years, we've had really, really solid evidence on this, and still a few people deny it. More recent article from Dario Hidalgo in Bogota asserts that, you know, most decision makers, most opinion makers, like people in the media, don't understand this yet. They're still under the impression that if you reduce the amount of space for cars to travel on, traffic congestion will get worse. And that perhaps some of them even assert that greenhouse gas pollution will go up. But when we look at examples like Seoul, Korea, which is illustrated in the photo, we see not only does greenhouse gas pollution go down, but even for the people who keep driving, the traffic conditions got better, not worse. And we've got municipalities now who are acknowledging this fact. The city of Vancouver, their climate emergency plan calls for reallocating at least 11% of road space to active transportation and transit, and clearly to quote, greatly reduce dependence on fossil fuels through a reduction in vehicle ownership and kilometers traveled by vehicle. This provides a really clear example for other municipalities to follow. BC Transit and TransLink also have a proposal that fits in very well with the idea of spurring on traffic evaporation. What they're calling a rapid bus, which is a bus rapid transit proposal. It's the idea of giving buses their own lanes and doing other things like all-door boarding to make it quicker, make it much more like the rapid transit that you expect to see on a rail-based transit, like light rail or SkyTrain. These are quick to build, low carbon footprint. The main way that you make these rapid buses rapid and reliable is reallocating existing road space to create bus lanes. And TransLink's proposing to expand rapid transit in the region by 300 kilometers by 2050. Most of this they're proposing to be bus rapid transit. And bus rapid transit can be very quick and inexpensive to do. A lot of it involves signaling and paint for bus lanes. This is these photographs are from Zurich, Switzerland, which has some of the highest transit ridership in Europe, and a lot of their transit network avoids being stuck in traffic just with very simple painted bus lanes, but very sophisticated signals to keep them rolling. Another thing we need to be keeping in mind is how space efficient transit is, and on the contrary, how inefficient cars are. One bus lane can move as many people as 5 lanes of cars. And very simply, because cars take a lot of space, people don't. All the people in those cars get seats in this bus. There's no standing room riders. So reallocating road space to create a bus lane greatly increases the number of people that a road can carry. Usually when road space is reallocated, cars keep moving at about the same speed in the area around it. And creating these 24/7 bus lanes is just an essential climate action that we just have to take. And another piece of this that is practical and actually fairly easy and is being done is shoulder bus lanes. This one's in Greater Victoria in Saanich. They cost less than 1/3 of the cost of creating a high occupancy vehicle lane. And they move far more people than a high occupancy vehicle lane. And they're really, really effective for creating suburban support for bus lanes and transit region-wide. This is just an example of one of the buses that uses this bus lane goes out to Souk. The 12% of the total trips between Victoria and Souk, which is, I don't know if all of you know it, but Souk is sort of, it's one of those places that if you call it a suburb, people get very upset because it's a rural area with farms and wilderness and bears, and 12% of total trips are by transit. 22% of peak trips were riding on transit even before they built these bus lanes. And by the way, it's not great service. There's a whole bunch of problems with the bus to Souk, which I could tell you when I had more time. Other thing that I think is really crucial is that electric buses are ready to roll. If we take the money away from highway expansion, airport expansion, we can afford to get these really nice, quiet electric buses on the road. This bus that I'm showing in the picture is Zurich, Switzerland. It's the kind of large electric buses that a lot of European cities are using. It's called a battery trolley bus, runs on wires or off. And that's the technology, electric bus technology of choice for bus rapid transit lines and other very demanding transit routes. TransLink's trolley bus fleet means that we've got the people who know how to string these wires and keep them running. And there's also other options that you're probably more familiar with, fast charging for medium duty routes and the overnight charging for the small buses like Handy Dart buses. Another piece that's really crucial is to think about the sidewalk as a crucial part of our transit network, and also the bike lane, because people get to transit and from transit by walking and riding bicycles and mobility scooters and wheelchairs. And it also makes that making pleasant places for people to walk and pleasant places for people to ride bicycles really makes our cities and suburbs as well much more pleasant, even delightful. And to my way of thinking, and there's some evidence for this, this is seeing that kind of on the ground climate action is the kind of thing that makes people overcome despair and go from despair to action. I also, coming at this from a climate justice point of view, I also want to really emphasize that we've got an aging population and we've got COVID. The percentage of people with disabilities in our society is increasing. And if we had to think about people with disabilities in the past, we have to do it a lot more now. And part of that is just making sure that the equipment we buy is accessible. Make sure we're not forgetting about the Handy Dart system, which is essential for people with disabilities. And also making sure that every piece of our transportation network is accessible. And Greater Victoria acting together, one of the things we did was to we are doing is advocating that mobility scooters and wheelchairs be allowed on the bike routes in our region. Affordable fares are also crucial. Chief Judy Wilson talked a lot about the cost of transportation and how essential that is for Indigenous people. It's essential for everybody, and it's essential for climate action that we have affordable fares. Drivers, people who have a car in their driveway are the people who are the most sensitive to transit fares. People think it seems counterintuitive, but it's not lower income people who are the most sensitive to, say, an increase in transit fares. It's the person who already has a working car in the driveway. And the free or deeply discounted transit paths for youth and low-income people, as the All on Board campaign is advocating for, is really crucial for not just for social justice, but for building support for the overall agenda of transformation of our transportation system. Yeah, the whole question of rural transit and between transit. Chief Judy Wilson covered this all very well. The only other thing I'd like to say is that it really is crucial for climate action and social justice in cities, as well as for the people who live in rural areas. And we can do it. We can create a system that is better and more affordable than Greyhound ever was. Part of that is actually electric buses. I don't think we should be thinking about electrifying the city transit systems and leaving the rural areas with stinky diesel buses. And BC Transit is probably the organization that is by far the best positioned to create the network. They've already created BC Bus North. They've got infrastructure in every small town, or not every small town, every community that has a transit service in the province. There's potential to use the same charging infrastructure for electric urban buses and highway buses. And obviously, if one organization is organizing it, it's much easier to have good transfers between the highway buses, intercommunity buses, and the local urban system. And then there's also avoiding the PC3 private contracting pitfalls that, well, maybe somebody wants to ask me a question about that if you're interested. And as I was saying, I think electric buses for rural areas are a crucial piece of this. They're quieter, they're nicer, but they're available already. There's already electric buses running on medium duty distance routes like Kamloops to Vancouver. But the challenges for the long distance routes are political and organizational, swappable batteries. Are we going to have batteries in trailers for the longer routes that are swapped out? Is it going to be battery coming in with like forklift-like devices like the Australian system? We don't know, but government is in the position to do this in a way for the whole province, in a way that an individual bus company running one or two lines just can't do. I also want to talk about the network effect that I mentioned Paul Meese at the beginning. We need, in order for the network effect to be important, it needs to be easy. We need to have one ticket. You need to be able to get from 100 Mile House to Port Hardy with one ticket, even if you have to make multiple transfers. You need the schedules to match up. You need frequent and reliable service. And in the where there's busier routes, higher density areas like Vancouver Island and the Okanagan, we can do what they do in Switzerland, which is clock-face schedules. A bus and a train, or everything connecting on a situation where they depart on the hour, every hour. And of course, free transfers to urban transit if, for example, you're coming in from somewhere else into Victoria or Vancouver or another city that's got an urban public transit system. Passenger rail is great. I love it. I love passenger rail. It's hard politically, financially. The tracks are controlled by big multinational corporations with lots of lawyers. It's a federal and a provincial issue, but it's a possibility. Once we start thinking about reallocating those billions and billions of dollars of federal funds away from highway and airport expansion, a real effective via rail network is a possibility. Chief Judy did a really great job talking about why the bus network is needed. I just want to also emphasize crash safety. This is a picture of one of the minor crashes that I passed when I was driving from 100 Mile House to Williams Lake in 2020. The next one we came to was way, way worse. Getting people out of cars and into buses is a hugely important safety issue. It's one of the most effective things we can do to reduce deaths and serious injuries. So I'm going to propose 3 actions, and I'm just going to go through them really quickly. They're also going to be online in the discussion paper. First is to get involved and endorse the Let's Ride campaign for Highway Bus. It's everything you need to know is at bcwidebus.com. The second is to take a look at Amnesty International's letter writing campaign to BC ministers, and take a look at the human rights case for highway bus service and better transit in our cities. And the third one, which I think is maybe the most important for people who are involved in groups, particularly local groups that have influence in your local communities, is challenge your elected municipal councillors and regional district directors to set a local target that matches or exceeds the provincial target of reducing vehicle travel 25% by 2030. And ask them to advocate for reallocating provincial and federal infrastructure funds away from highway expansion to transit and active transportation. One of the groups I'm involved in, Greater Victoria Acting Together, just sent a letter to the city of Victoria doing exactly that. And you can find out more about it on our website, gvat.ca. And that's it for my presentation. I'm just looking forward to some questions and conversation.
Eric, that was wonderful. It was so rich. There was so much in there. And I mean, we could do many, many hours, I'm sure, on this. This idea of traffic evaporation, you can just look at COVID and how many downtown municipalities shut down streets for businesses to have their patios to walk down. So, it's such a real thing that we can absolutely address through some local municipal planning. And on that, municipal planning and government in general, governments are reactive. So people need to speak up. They need to make some noise, polite noise, but they need to actually say, this is important to us. And if our elected officials don't know that, they're not going to change anything. They're happy with the status quo. So speaking up is so important. Just going to flag the Q&A questions. I have been trying to monitor that. So that is wonderful. Please go in, put your questions in the Q&A. Also, you can upvote. There's little thumbs up. So press those up, and then we know that those are really priority for more people in the group. I am going to try to prioritize some rural questions first, just because we know Cookie Wilson is sort of en route, so we may lose her, but I would love to have her some insights on some of these questions. And as I let that kind of repopulate here, we've got one more poll here. Sebastian, if you can pull it up here, and it is specifically about the bus, about a bus service. Do you support the need for a BC-wide intercommunity bus service that is better and more affordable than Greyhound ever was by shifting financial resources from highways to public transportation? I'm going to have a guess. I know where a lot of these questions are going to land, but it's fun anyway. Let's see what kind of support we have for this, something that we will eventually be coming back to. And I think, my goodness, we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in here and going back and forth. This is wonderful. And I'm going to guess it's probably just about it. I can't quite see the full responses here. 91%. That's quite overwhelming. 91% of you would love to see a BC-wide bus. A BC North bus would probably be a wonderful model to look at. Nobody said no, so we are on board there. So that is wonderful. And with that, I'm going to dive into the questions right now, if everyone's comfortable with that. The first one, it came through a few times by a few different people. It's about a task force. So if the province was to establish a task force to set up a province-wide intercommunity bus service, who would you recommend to be on that task force? So that's wonderful, considering different perspectives. Cookie Wilson, if you're there, that would be great if you've got an answer. I know that you're sort of in and out of service, so maybe Eric, you can jump in with a few suggested people or professions or areas to respond to that about a task force.
Yeah, I think that Indigenous representation on that would be essential, but also regional district representatives from from the various regions around the province are crucial. And as far as input into it, I think that this is one thing where it'd be worth the cost and carbon footprint of flying some people in from other countries that have much better bus networks than we do to present about how they do things.
Wonderful. So Chief Wilson, I'm not too sure if you're frozen or just sort of out of service there, but please feel free to come up on the screen if you have a little bit more to add on to that. You know, I think the key thing with any task force is ensuring there's adequate representation. And when we talk about social justice and equity, ensuring we have got people of color, we have people with disabilities. And, you know, you mentioned the handy dart and situations for people with health issues trying to get into, a lot of the health services are in the urban centers. And so how do we get there? So ensuring that representation is there. Guy, I noticed that you had actually flagged you would like to answer a question. I don't know if that was just a little technical hiccup about rural transportation. So I don't know if you want to dive in and respond to that.
No, that was just a technical hiccup, not to worry about that one.
Okay, somebody just asked if there will be a discussion around rural transportation. So yes, we're trying to ensure that there is, you know, considerations. We have a lot of different issues out in rural areas, just longer distances and how to address that. I saw another question here, I believe CL, hi CL, about the highway. There's a highway road widening happening between Greenwood and Grand Forks, about 5 kilometers, reportedly to a 4-lane highway. How can I find out how much money is being invested in this? The regional district of Kootenay Boundary has declared a climate emergency and will be working on a climate response plan soon. This highway money could have been diverted to mass transit. And I think not even just specifically for the Grand Forks area, but just in general in BC, how can people go about addressing these things that are happening?
Yeah, as far as finding out how much they cost, the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure does have a project by project like websites on each of their projects with estimated costs. So it's actually fairly easy to find out about one project, much harder to find out about their future plans and how much they're spending overall on expansion versus maintaining our roads. Because that's, you know, everybody knows that we need to continue to maintain the roads and even upgrade them so they can survive the torrential rainfall and other climate impacts we've got. But that question of how many billions are going to expand roads that don't need to be expanded is it's a very interesting one.
Yes, and trying to, again, I think it's about speaking up and letting your elected officials know where do you want the money spent there, and really making that voice heard. I do have a specific question here about colonization. So Eric and I'm sure we'll do our best to respond and answer to this, Diane. Again, once again, Chief Wilson, if you are still there, we'd love to have your insight on this one. How do we get it across to everyone that any kind of transportation from the very beginning of colonization was put in for the purpose of pushing westward for the purposes of land seizure, exploitation of land and resources, and for the purposes of industry, not for the convenience of transportation of people? And is it any different now? Just going to pause here. I'm so sad Chief Wilson couldn't respond to this one. Once again, if you're able to call back in, that would be a wonderful question. Eric, do you have some immediate thoughts on this one?
Just to the question of what has changed, has anything changed? I think one thing did change after World War II, which is that the highway expansion became largely about creating a market for things like oil and rubber and automobiles. It was actually an economic development strategy designed to increase consumption, which obviously is no longer sustainable. That model, that idea of spending public money in order to create a market for yet more oil is not where we can go anymore.
And I see Chief Wilson is here. Did you hear the question, or should I repeat it?
I'm not sure you can very well.
It sounds like we've got some connection issues. Yes, so she is in, you know, and we talk about transportation issues and access and ensuring safety. So yeah, the question was just in regards to the, the purpose of,
Can you hear me?
you cut out for quite some time.
Oh yeah, I know I went around the corner, but can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Can you rephrase that question and I can try to answer it quickly?
Yeah, just trying to ensure that people are aware of why roads were put in here in the first place for the process of colonization to expressly seize and exploit resources and land, and not for transportation of people. And is that any different today?
Yeah, our Indigenous people know that history so well because the railways displaced our people. With the Indian Act, they displaced us from our territorial land and put us on small reservations. The Squamish territory was 180,000 square kilometers, and they created 17 bands. There used to be 32 campfires or villages, and after the smallpox epidemics, we were only probably a very small fraction of our nation, which they say was about 100,000, and went down to about 2,000 or 3,000. Our nation was just about exterminated. So the purposes of the railway were to ship goods and for economic purposes, as you mentioned. And it did include at one time, if you showed your status card, you could board the train and jump on it. But they did away with that once they had the Rocky Mountaineer via rail. But, it displaced, and it was a lot of marginalization, and it cut through our reserve with an order in council. I know our bands, there was about 11 in the canyon and our Scrub Nation that went through a class settlement action in regard to CP Rail that have settlement agreements, but it wasn't very much. And we weren't even accessible to the DT fiber optics that were along the railway line. So the railways and the highways and all of that transportation issues were done without us. And I know the history all too well. And we're just dealing with highway expansion in our community as well. So, we made sure we did a highway corridor agreement from Monty Creek to Alberta, and we listed all our issues and needs in there. And we did have the UN declaration before it was provincial or federal legislation. And we had our 1910 Sir Wilfrid Laurier Memorial in it, which our ancestral chiefs laid out. So yeah, the colonization through the railways and the highways impacted our communities greatly. And so with that reconciliation with the UN declaration, I think that'd be opportunity to reconcile those issues with our Indigenous people and how we're disproportionately impacted now by highways and railways and transportation in general. Thank you.
I have another one I think would be a good one for you too, Chief Wilson, if we still have you for another minute. And it's a very specifically for women and gender-based, and what can we do to overcome the nervousness and fear that many women have of traveling on the bus in rural but also urban areas when there may not be other passengers or they just don't feel safe?
Well, I think the Circle of Network of Women, I know we started one called House of the Moon, and it's North American wide. And we train trainers that go into the community. And I know Gladys Raddick would be an excellent resource on talking about how we could do that for highway tiers, for example, and maybe a number they could contact, and a circle of network of women that could help them. But also, the support networks are so important, and making it meaningful to them. So we have to be able to do engagement with the women and communities who would be using the transport to make sure it's meaningful, meaning what time is it available, are the prices affordable, if there's safety concerns, who do they contact, if they had an experience, how do they file a complaint about it. A lot of times these are not reported, and that's another issue, and there's not enough data around it. And also having these discussion forums in the community for women so that they can have circles to talk about the issues they face with public transportation. I always say sometimes we don't know enough and we're making assumed decisions on behalf of the people that are affected. So we need to know what the issues are and the needs are, and better approaches on doing that. So I always caution government when they're doing that, because sometimes they always assume a certain way would be best, and without talking to the grassroots people or the people that are affected, and how we can make some of those meaningful changes. But I think it starts with being inclusive, and it starts by having those meaningful discussions, and then monitoring it, and then seeing is it working, not working, and having that way that there could be continued evaluation and continued input and ways to make it affordable and meaningful to our Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit.
Thank you so much. I've got a couple questions here on land use planning. I'm going to kind of combine two here. Mark wants to know how to address zoning and land use, especially in suburbs and rural areas that may be challenging for improving public transit. And in addition to that point, how do we address the housing needs in tandem with transportation needs? Eric, this sounds like a question right up your alley.
Yeah, the way I would put it is that transportation planning is land use planning, and land use planning is transportation planning. They fit together so tightly. But to me, the crucial point is that you can change a transportation system quicker than you can change land use. So we can change our transportation system, transform it to be much more transit oriented before we change the land use. And having the transit in place and the transit ridership, people riding transit, makes the land use changes easier, because one of the big barriers to having more people in areas higher density is parking. And that's the objection to having apartment buildings quite often is, oh, well, where will people park? It's also the objection to secondary suites. Well, there'll be too many people parking their cars on the street. So once you have the transit service and fewer people driving cars, that part becomes easier. And it also becomes more affordable, because if you're building an apartment building with underground parking, a parking spot now often costs $60,000. So, if people don't realize how much of that, the rent that they pay for a new apartment building is going to pay for the parking spot that they may not be able to afford to put a car in.
A couple questions here kind of around budgeting. And, the one example here is Luxembourg announced free public transit, urban and rural, across the entire country to citizens and to visitors. Is that something that we could advocate for in BC? Would that be feasible? When we talk about increasing all these things, we do have to pay for it somehow.
Yeah, I'm going to say that it's actually fairly easy in small communities that don't have big transit ridership at the moment, and they get only a small percentage of the cost of the transit from the fare box. It gets harder in bigger cities where there's transit overcrowding already and things like that. And I think that's basically the situation, is that in some places it's pretty easy, in other places it's pretty challenging.
So once again, just no one size fits all solution, right? It really does have to be locally placed. And again, like Chief Wilson was talking about, ensuring that we're actually speaking with the people who are going to be, using the service. I know I'm not going to get through all these questions, and so I do apologize in advance. It's wonderful to see all these. I'm hoping we can maybe capture some of these as we carry on into our actions, but I think we have time for a few more here. EVs, big talks about shifting to electric vehicles. And, there's this concern too, as well as what's the impact on the EVs on the environment and the communities. When we look at resource extraction, in order to electrify, we need to mine to get lithium, to get the batteries. And so we have organizations like Destination BC who are supporting or pushing for EV single occupancy vehicles instead of perhaps supporting electric bus transportation. So do you think that there's a role for organizations like tourism organizations to be pushing more of a mass transit instead of these individual vehicles?
That's actually a really great suggestion and a great question. The fact is that a fair bit of our tourist industry does run on buses already. It's something that a lot of people, particularly seniors, the bus tour is a big part of of the tourist industry. But I also think that it's good bus service is crucial for the economies of rural regions, not just for tourism. It's for every form of economic development. If you can't get there, people aren't going to want to live there. Younger people who live in cities, a lot of their friends don't have cars. Are they going to want to move to your town if you can't get there from the city and their friends can't visit them? People like me who live in cities at the coast, are we really comfortable driving in a blizzard for 7 hours, in our tiny little hatchback cars amongst all those semis? No, so it's got the potential to be a real benefit for our tourist industry, particularly the local or the regional tourist industry, where people are coming from, say, Vancouver to visit the interior of BC. And they're much more likely to do it if they don't have to rent a car to get there.
Well, I know the city of Penticton has been really pushing their e-bikes for getting around for tourism. Their whole push, I forget what their slogan is, but it's park your car, take an e-bike, and they have e-bike rentals available. And I mean, who wouldn't want to do an Okanagan wine tour on an e-bike? I mean, that sounds like a fantastic idea to me. One of the questions that have been receiving a lot of upvotes here, so I don't want to ignore it. John is wanting to know about the BC government's, I guess, rationale and process for not reactivating the interurban electric rail system that ran from Chilliwack to Vancouver 100 years ago. We own the rail corridor, and instead BC is adding lanes to the freeway. I am not familiar with this initiative at all. I hope you are, Eric. It's very specific.
Yeah, well, I think that I'll generalize the question a little bit. I'll take a little bit of the thing. The provincial government is in the Fraser Valley is expanding highways instead of improving any form of public transit. I think, for example, that shoulder bus lanes out on Highway 1 to the valley in a lot of those areas, it should be done right away. A lot of places it could probably be done without widening the paved area and for very low cost. The existing rail lines is actually a really good point. There's more than one. There's one on Vancouver Island. There's one on in the Fraser Valley. And there's also the question of adding tracks beside the freight railways. All those things can be done, but all of them are considerably more expensive than putting on electric buses. And so a fair bit of what we need to do, even though I love trains, I just acknowledge that a fair bit of what we need to do in the next 5 to 10 years is going to have to be on rubber tires, just because of the cost and the carbon footprint of building these things, even when you've got the right of way.
Sorry about that. I was just checking on something here. Have a request. Just pulling this up. Aha, David Suzuki is here, and he has a chat comment here. And so Guy just wanted to bring it up. Hello, it's wonderful. I don't have a list of everyone being here. That's lovely that you're here. So for those of us that missed his comment in the chat, he did want to emphasize that his comment is, as a carbon sinner, I've taken a vow to give up flying jets, but wow, is it hard because of infrastructure that we don't have? Leave for Banff Friday to a film interview with David Klein on geoengineering. Would have preferred to go by train, and my 5-year-old Nissan Leaf only gets 150 kilometers per charge. I have to go to Toronto in June, but again, it's hard, especially when the train has twice the carbon footprint as an economy airfare. again, it just speaks to the need for infrastructure, and how we really have to have more than just a local focus. We need to have national infrastructure upgrades, support from higher orders of government to go through with this. Yes, I agree. It's hard to get around. I don't know, Eric, if you have anything to add aside from just trying to, I think one thing we need to stop doing is demonizing people. It's not going to move the conversation forward. And so we really have to recognize that we are trying to make choices, that we can make choices in our own personal lives, but there are these big systems that we have to be advocating for. And sometimes there's an instance where somebody has to be in Toronto. They have to get to Toronto.
Yeah, the one thing I'd say is that there's a lot of short haul flights going on. The Vancouver airport expansion that's not being done because there's to get more jets going to Toronto and long distance. That's for largely for the large number of short haul flights for fairly short distances like Kelowna and Kamloops and even Calgary and Edmonton. And other countries, even on existing freight rail lines, run sleeper trains. Sweden in particular has started adding more sleeper trains specifically because people don't want to fly. And there was a public demand for sleeper trains so that people could travel overnight rather than making these short 1 hour and a half flights into places like Germany.
You know what, I'm just looking at the time here, and I feel like maybe this is a really great time we can end on the esteemed David Suzuki's comment. That was so exciting for me. And just kind of wrap everything up here, because I really do want to talk a little bit about some action steps that are available. We've got a letter that's being developed. And so thank you so much, everybody that was able to attend here today. This webinar has been recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube, and that information will be sent out. And you can always, of course, check back on WeCan's website. Maybe somebody can plug WeCan's website there in the chat so everybody has access to it. We have a petition that's being developed. It's not quite finalized yet. We're just kind of tweaking and making sure we have some language, but this is something that we would love it if people could sign on to. It is for a fabulous BC-wide bus service is how it was labeled. I'm wondering if Eric or Guy would like to take a moment to pitch the petition.
Why don't we let Guy do that?
I can do that. Yeah, we're crafting this petition to be sent to fundamentally the core provincial ministers, the Minister of the Premier, Minister of Transportation, Minister of Climate Change, Finance and Infrastructure. And it'll be an organizational sign-on. So we're asking that they do what is necessary to get this thing rolling. It's some sort of task force, some sort of study, some sort of whatever it takes. And in about a week's time, we'll be ready for both organizational sign-ons and then for individual sign-ons. And we'll sort of put some pressure on this and really get it before people, because there is just so many strong arguments that say this has to happen. We need a world-class, interprovincial, intercommunity, affordable, BC-wide, and some more adjectives, bus service. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. Yeah, so that more information will be coming out hopefully within the week. And I do apologize to everybody that we weren't able to get to every question. It really does speak to the need and the interest in this conversation and this topic, and why we need to keep talking about it and putting pressure on our local, provincial, and federal representatives to take transportation options really seriously, because there are definitely things that we can do as individuals, and there are things that we need some supports on from those senior orders of government. We do have, like I said, this is a 4-part series. This was number 1. We have number 2 coming up on Wednesday, April 13th, 4 o'clock. We're going to be talking about active transportation, definitely something I absolutely am passionate about and really love talking about. And Trish Donnell, who is a planner as well, whom I actually quite love Trish, so I'm so excited that she'll be presenting at this webinar. And I believe there's going to be a link coming down in there that people can go register for right away. But otherwise, I think we can end the event. Like I said, keep an eye out for WeCan's website. as well as the 2-page discussion paper will also be on the website. And then we will be getting out the petition in, the next week or so. Thank you again, everyone, so much for being here today. And I hope everyone has a great evening.